Okay, so the COVID-19 epidemic is the most significant crisis in generations, particularly for Western countries like Australia, Western Europe, the UK, Canada, and the US. It's the most significant crisis since World War II. It is a crisis that has affected every aspect of people's lives. Currently, the death toll stands at something over 350,000 people. Obviously, the most affected country is the United States, with just over 100,000 deaths as of today or yesterday. So the death rate itself is staggering and has exposed weaknesses of governments and how prepared or underprepared they were for a crisis like this. And most importantly, it's exposed a country's healthcare system. And again, the US is the most pertinent example of this. The economic, social, and political consequences of this pandemic have only begun to be felt. It is likely a truly transformative moment. It is a moment that is difficult to comprehend, articulate, and come to terms with, both on an intellectual level, and it must be said on a personal level as well. Simply put, so much has changed and so much has been lost so swiftly. 350,000 have perished, financial markets have bottomed out, and many economies are on the brink of depression. And during all of this, we have been stuck at home watching Netflix. The social distancing requirements to battle the virus have made this truly a bizarre time. And a small example of this strangeness is the fact that just last month, the Australian federal government asked Netflix and Stan to lower its video streaming quality because it was taking up too much of the country's internet. So yes, these are truly bizarre times. In this evening's talk, I'm going to split my time into three broad categories. So this is a bit simplistic, but I think it's the best way to convey kind of a large amount at once. My first theme will be looking at the immediate effects of the crisis. What have been the most significant political developments of the crisis? Governments have had to take extraordinary amounts of power, not seen since wartime. And what has this meant for the development of politics? The second theme will briefly explore possible avenues beyond the crisis. What will a post-COVID world look like? Is that even possible to imagine at this point? I'll try to speak only in very broad terms, since trying to tell the future is always fraught with difficulties, and whoever does so in like specific detail is always wrong. So rather, I will talk about possible avenues politics will take as we come to terms with the first spike of this pandemic. And the third will attempt to place Skiff and Bun's ideology in this new world. The COVID crisis is capitalism's worst episode since the Depression. Its significance has now dwarfed the financial crisis of 2007, 2008. And what does this mean for the left? What does this mean for democratic socialism? Has the crisis highlighted the worst elements of capitalism and globalization, or has it highlighted the limitations of the world's interconnectedness, resulting in an inward, perhaps more right-wing turn? So as I said before, none of this is on concrete. The crisis is still in its early stages, and there are countless unforeseeable possibilities. So this necessitates any analysis to be very broad. So now turning to my first theme, what has happened in the last few months? In late December, the Wuhan Municipal Health Commission reported a cluster of cases of pneumonia. A new type of coronavirus was identified. By the end of January, the Chinese central government imposed lockdown on Wuhan and its surrounding cities. The extent of the crisis was exemplified by the lightning-fast construction of large hospitals to accommodate the surging infection rates. The Leil Hospital was constructed in under 10 days and could house over 1,000 patients. By February, the cases spread to Europe, most significantly to Italy, moving on to Spain and then the UK, and the UK is the most badly affected in Europe. And by March, the World Health Organization had declared a pandemic. In response to the crisis, the arms of government were extended into very intimate parts of our lives. Government began significant amounts of social control. Public gatherings were banned, sport was banned, gyms were closed. People were not just told, but in many countries, legally obligated to stay home. Large aspects of society have been shut down by governments in a bid to contain and mitigate infection rates. And obviously, some governments have been very successful at this, most notably Australia, New Zealand, South Korea, Israel, Singapore to a certain extent, and Vietnam. And Germany was probably the best responder in Europe. We are all intimately aware of this social distancing. So I'll cut a very long story short because we all know what social distancing is. But governments have had to make extraordinary interventions in both public and private lives to contain this pandemic. The extent of the intervention is unprecedented. Even during World War II, people were allowed to leave their homes and go to work. And in fact, if they worked in factories, they were obligated to do so. So the politics around social distancing has seen some fascinating phenomenon taking on its own dimensions beyond government regulation. People are all of a sudden hyper aware of not just their own movements, but movements of their families, friends, and strangers in their immediate vicinity. Social distancing has rapidly become a distinct social phenomenon that has produced its own social controls beyond that of government oversight. A truly remarkable occurrence, given that we've only been living with social distancing for around 3 months. The social distancing requirements has meant that the global economy, that is totally interconnected, has essentially shut down for the most part. In March alone, stock markets around the world crashed and loans for businesses dried up effectively overnight. The response to this by governments very much mirrored their social distancing response. Further intervention to stave off even worse economic meltdown. Huge amounts of money were spent to spend supporting businesses who were struggling. The fast growth of unemployment were given some respite in expanded welfare programs. And most of this was done by governments already in debt. And this was all done to stave off, essentially, the collapse of capitalism itself. A noteworthy mention in all of this is that most of these governments that did these things were conservative. These right-wing governments were forced by such extreme circumstances to go against much of their political instincts and bring government at the front and center of economic management, something that is normally associated with leftists. Just a few months ago, right-wing governments, wedded to an ideology of free market and minimum government intervention, had to do a complete 180. This is not totally unprecedented. 10 years ago, during the financial crisis, the Bush administration administered the first round of stimulus packages. But nonetheless, it is certainly telling that such a crisis has forced political parties, normally devoted to free market economics, to become the most interventionist governments in more than 70 years. The pandemic has confronted our political and economic system in a truly revealing manner. It is often said, particularly by historians, and this is quite biased of me, that things like war, financial crisis, or in this case, a pandemic, doesn't just create new problems, it exacerbates ongoing ones as well. For instance, the downfall of the Russian monarchy in 1917 was hastened by World War I, but there had been significant social problems for decades before that. The pandemic has demonstrated some glaring issues that have been papered over for a number of years. Most starkly in the US, the lack of universal health system has been an ongoing problem for decades. Now the virus has laid bare this fundamental weakness in US society. America's decentralized system of power and its lackluster leadership in Trump has yielded truly cataclysmic results. The US is the world's financial hegemon, and despite all of this, it can't actually respond effectively to the crisis in its own borders. It should be worth noting that the US system is not the only one that could not cope with the pandemic. Britain, the country once with at one time one of the most impressive and extensive universal health systems in the world, has now suffered from decades of underfunding. It too had trouble coping with the pandemic, and it has had one of the highest fatality rates in the world. This has much to do with both the ailing health system and also the pretty abysmal government response in the first weeks of the crisis. I can tell you I was right there when they should have done a lot of things and they didn't. Around the world, the economic shutdown has exacerbated issues that have been well known for years. Many Western countries in the past 40 years, including our own, have seen a transformation in the nature of employment. Full-time employment is becoming a sought-after commodity in itself due to years of a certain economic orthodoxy that has reduced union powers and has seen a growth in service industries that thrive off short-term contracts. Things like Uber is a good example. Also, the university sector is another good example. People work in precarious jobs. The economic shutdown has brutally exposed the limitations of this. The moment people stopped going out and consuming was the moment these jobs evaporated, or at the least halted. So now onto some potentials for the future. It should not go without saying this is only the very beginning of the crisis. We have not yet seen the inevitable second spike, if not here, then elsewhere. But politics in the short term has seen some fundamental shifts. Given the huge economic intervention by so many governments, the way we speak about economics will likely change. So much of the public debates in the past 40 years has been about the extent of government's debt and expenditure. The classic argument would go that a government is like a household. It cannot spend more than it makes. Now, this has always been incorrect. Most countries can print their own currencies, very much unlike households. But with the huge amount of sovereign debt that has accrued over the last few months, this line of argument will no longer work. The coming issues we are going to face will mean government will likely have to continue with some forms of intervention for the time being. Already, the US is seeing 14% unemployment last month, and this will probably rise. And government stimulus will likely continue to prop up economies already on the precipice. Though it must be said there are other possibilities too, and I'll around this, and I'll return to this at the end of speech. In the short term, the likely political fights will be about the extent of this intervention. Already, our own conservative federal government has begun to make noises about curtailing the expansion of welfare. Many in the Liberal Party, and I suspect in other like-minded parties, simply see government handouts as making people entitled and reliant on the government and ultimately work shy. This obviously has little bearing on reality, but these arguments remain powerful in parts of the public sphere. In the coming months and years, we will likely see fierce debates over the role of government in a post-COVID economy. I suspect that governments will be much more willing to hand out money to big business rather than workers in a bid to prop up the status quo and to keep people in precarious work. The last thing conservative parties want is Labor to be reorganized. That is unions and stuff. The other set of themes and questions obviously interconnected with inequality are questions surrounding immigration, multiculturalism, and racism. The pluralistic society we want to build will be seriously questioned. Politics in many countries, particularly Australia, the UK, the US, and the EU, have had very corrosive debates around immigration. The pandemic has exposed some of the dangers with an interconnected world, and this will likely spark even further skepticism towards immigration and will further racism in general. In the past decades, it has been parties on the right who have brutally but effectively wielded this as an electoral weapon with very ugly results. So much of the Brexit campaign, for instance, was focused on migration to Britain. Many of it, ironically, was not even targeted towards European immigrants, but from countries that were not white. This, I fear, will be amplified by the COVID-19 crisis. Nationalism in this sense will also likely be amplified, as these two things always go hand in hand. And now that the government has taken more powers and has been kind of re-legitimized by the crisis, there is likely a chance we see further degeneration to authoritarian style governments in the near future. And remember, authoritarian style governments are not just the purview of undemocratic countries, but of countries with functioning democratic systems. And now we might call them illiberal democracies. And I'm talking now about countries like Hungary, Poland, the US to a certain extent, Israel, and Brazil. So some of the things I've said are bleak, but as Yanis Varoufakis, the one-time radical Greek finance minister, said a few days ago, it doesn't have to be like this. The things that SCIF and would stand for, that is democratic socialism or social democracy, this transformative moment we could take advantage of, both in a productive and in a progressive manner. It requires imagination combined with some hard-headed thinking by people on the left. So to put it succinctly, socialism is about extending democracy from the political sphere into the economic one. It is about empowering people not just on a political level, but on a material one as well. It is about sharing a nation's resources for all to enjoy. Socialism has always been about eliminating scarcity. At the beginning of the speech, I mentioned that the pandemic was the most significant crisis since World War II for many countries. And going back to this briefly, after World War II, many countries in the post-war moment took it upon themselves to remold and remake society so as not to repeat the same mistakes that actually led to World War II. Global institutions were established in an attempt to regulate geopolitics, and importantly, from what I'm talking about, governments hugely expanded welfare. And it was in the post-war world that gave birth to universal healthcare. Before World War II, most countries did not have a universal healthcare system. Unfortunately, societies have historically embraced systemic change after crisis. So while COVID-19 has exposed so many of the world's shortcomings, it has also the potential to reshape things to come, things for the better. This is not the space to sort of talk about it or to make a blueprint about such things, but it is clear that things need to be substantially changed to tackle inequality and slow economic growth. So many of the virus deaths have occurred in marginalized communities. For instance, Black Americans are dying at 3 times the rate of white Americans. And now that the virus is beginning to ravage Brazil, its most vulnerable population are within its infamous slums, the favelas. Such changes must take the environment into consideration, something I have not had time to mention tonight. COVID-19 has reminded us that governments have the power to enact very vast social change quickly. So why can't this be used to implement things like universal income or to prop up much needed green industries, something that should be surely a potential path for both growth and environmental protection. Socialists must seek to end precarity in work. People need long-term sustainable jobs that they are not consistently fearful of losing. If there are no jobs, then people should be guaranteed an income. And socialists must also think in a defensive fashion, I think. As I said before, racism and xenophobia will likely be further amplified by all of this, and we need to combat this with our every breath. I do not need to remind this audience that racialized visions of politics are deeply destructive. And the other real threat is that governments could decide to drastically scale back their interventions. I've described above, it's not hard to imagine that that once the pandemic is over and global infection rates have decreased, governments could pare back their welfare extensions. And this too would be disastrous. Leftists, and in this case, particularly mainstream left-wing parties, may have to mount a serious opposition to this. So the COVID pandemic is a systemic crisis, the likes of which we have not seen. While history is made up of earth-shattering events that seemingly change everything, it is best to remember nothing happens in a vacuum, particularly not deep-seated political and economic issues. We must realize that many of the things we are dealing with have been on the back burner for a while now. The crises have both highlighted and amplified this. SCIF and the Bund's commitment to socialism is now more relevant than ever. Equality and material prosperity for all, coupled with an environmentally sustainable economy, are the only constructive ways forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex, or some people know him as Chonkers. I thought that was very, very interesting. And we'll now open the floor up to questions. So those of you who know how to use Zoom, we'll be using the raise hand feature. And Alex will call on you. And when he does, you can unmute yourself and ask the question if you do have one.
Okay. Um, I'm going to admit my shortcomings here. How does this raise hand thing? I think Mia has a question. Am I right there?
Yeah.
Okay. Excellent.
Okay.
Yes.
So you mentioned like universal employment, or the fact that people should have stable wages and jobs.
Universal income.
Yes, universal income.
Mhm.
So in what industries do you think that's possible?
Well, a universal income is not really in an industry. It's more in a sense you access it from the government. So
Right,
at
but
the
how
moment,
how can that happen?
right?
Like, how can that happen? Don't industries
Well,
have to exist to provide jobs, or like that? Doesn't the government have to get funding from somewhere, from taxes or something?
yeah, that's a good question. So yeah, there. I think one of the persistent problems that governments have had in the past 10 years, but more 20 or 30 years, was actually like tax collection. It's quite simple. It's a bit unsexy, but a lot of countries have struggled to essentially tax very wealthy people, very wealthy countries, with very wealthy companies, because they've hidden it overseas. And many people have written about this, like places like the Cayman Islands and things like that are classic tax havens. So I think there would need to be some kind of global agreement to tackle that problem, because the money doesn't just dry up, it actually goes somewhere. But also, I think in general, there may need to be a total rethink about how we work, as in how people work, the hours they work, and how people pay income tax to afford such things. Um, so there will need to be essentially a rethink about how essentially governments collect money and how they redistribute it. For instance, we actually the Australia now effectively kind of has a universal income through job seek and job starter. Now this will definitely be cut off by the government in the coming months, but it's not hard to see that could be facilitated by something like this.
Okay, thank you.
Oh, okay, well, okay. Beck?
Yeah, so first of all, I think there are so many different things to unpack in all of this. There are so many different levels. But I just want to ask you, like, you sound quite optimistic.
Mm.
And I look at this whole situation from like the complete other side. I'm like maybe the most pessimistic Bundist out there, because I just feel like I look at all the people around me and I feel like, is it not just going to go back to exactly how it was? And you gave the example of things turning around after World War II, but am I being too pessimistic, or are you being too optimistic, or is there something like in the middle?
Well, it's actually really funny you say that, because I was reading through my speech before and I said to Karen, my partner, I was like, God, this is such a pessimistic speech. So because I only really concentrate on the optimistic parts in the last 2 minutes. I have to say that I, in a way, feel quite similar to you, is that I ultimately am pessimistic. I don't think things will go back to normal. I do think, though, things could possibly be worse, if that makes sense. I think particularly politics will become much more xenophobic. Already, I mean, when I was in Britain, like I worked with a lot of people from China, and they were afraid to walk the streets of London because there were violence against Chinese students. And I think in the coming decade, I mean, we've already had very xenophobic election campaigns and things in Australia, and I think that this will be a really destructive issue for the next decade or so because of this. And I think that the economic recovery will be really lackluster, to say the least. And I think that we might be like countries that have not seen high unemployment for a very long time will see it for maybe a decade or so to come. So yeah, I have to say that I have a pessimistic attitude as well. But also there is room, I think, to rethink society, particularly after such a huge crisis. People usually are kind of up for anything. I know that sounds strange, but I mean, this is sort of going beyond like the intellectual side. When you speak to people now, I mean, I think people are kind of open to anything after such a sort of cataclysmic event. That's my. But I also, this is not a kind of a long-winded answer, but I also sort of feel the same way as you. I can't really give you.
Thanks. It's
Yeah.
yeah, I just look even just at the economic side of it, and I'm like, you know, everyone knows what their own personal experience is, and for me right now, childcare is completely free, and that's already finishing in a month. And
Yeah.
the government's like, nah, no way are we
Yeah.
keeping it free. And it's a perfect example of like a socialist ideal that's been put in place that they're already just backtracking because they can't afford it forever.
Mm.
And I'm just like, well, if that's what they're doing in that one area, like I can't see, I
Yeah.
can't see the rest of it being so optimistic. But again, maybe I'm too pessimistic. Sorry, I'll let other people ask questions.
Okay, so the next person, their name is in either Hebrew or Yiddish, and I embarrassingly can't read it.
Cover Danielle. So Dan.
Okay.
That's me. Hey,
Okay.
hey, Chonkers.
Hello.
So I guess, yeah, like you were saying before about the world more readily accepting, or the bigger changes coming after big events such as wars and things. What do you think are some main lessons that we can learn from reactions to big events like this in the past, and ways that we can, I guess, implement them or consider them going forward at the moment?
Yeah, I think that these crises, they bring up new problems, and the new problems like are going to be about biosecurity and things like that to combat reemergence of the virus. But they also highlight ongoing issues and things that have been a problem for a long time, and the pandemic has exposed them. And I think the precarious work, the nature of work, and the precariousness around work has definitely been exposed. Like all of a sudden, when people stop going out, they stop taking Ubers, they stop going to cafes, like a whole industries of jobs just sort of dry up overnight. And since that they're on short-term contracts or they're on 0-hour contracts, um, they're essentially jobless after, they have a job one day and they don't have a job the next day. And so I think that this sort of thing teaches us that, as I said, no problems happen in a vacuum. I think that if we had slightly different economic and political institutions, that the crisis was always going to be bad, but it would definitely be mitigated by a lot of things, by certain safety nets and certain other socialist policies. And the lesson is, and it's interesting that this notions of lessons, because like in a weird way, we have learned some lessons. I know that hasn't sort of seen, like, doesn't sort of seem like that from what I've said. But given the huge amount of government spending that we've seen by particularly right-wing governments, that's definitely lessons learned from both the previous financial crisis and in the Depression. In the Depression, governments didn't spend anything. They thought that they would actually cut their budgets, and that actually made the Depression worse. So we have kind of learned some lessons in that instance, but I think um, the main thing to take away in this is that we're witnessing sort of an unprecedented social crisis, the likes of which we have not seen, and that will, in some ways, remold the way people think about politics. Like, and it's unclear where that's going to go, but I have no doubt that things will change for the better or for the worse in the next 10 years, like in a much more rapid pace than they have previously. That's my only kind of real takeaway from that. I know that's an ambiguous answer. Excellent. Okay, I'm just going to go down the thing. There's Jess and Ash.
Okay, so my question is that you mentioned how things are going to change on like a global and political stance. What do you think will change on like a more personal level, like people's everyday lives?
Yeah. Well, I think the really strange thing about this is that it's already changed so rapidly. Like we're already like conscious about what we touch, where we go, who we talk to, in a way that no one could possibly imagine. And this has happened in like 3 months. Like we've been living with social distancing for 3 months, and yet it has felt like much longer than 3 months. Not just because we're all bored at home, but because our lives have changed like so rapidly, so quickly. And it, as I said, it's hard to tell where things are going to go, but I suspect that people will probably feel a lot of the anxieties they feel now in the future. I think a lot of people will be much more conscious of things like cleanliness and hygiene for the coming decades in a way that like we just didn't beforehand. So yeah, I think on a personal level, actually, we all feel it, and I think the next few years, when the pandemic is finally over, or if it's ever over, I think none of us will essentially go back to our previous mentality. It'll change somewhat, I think. Yeah. Okay, so the next person down the list also has a Yiddish name.
That was probably me. Do you recommend that the left should be fighting for universal basic income or a universal jobs guarantee?
Oh, that's a really good question. Maybe both. I don't know. I think perhaps the two are not necessarily separate. I've definitely read sort of imaginings of a system where people can have kind of a job 2 or 3 days a week and then a universal income on top of that. And the universal income actually is not just about being unemployed. The idea behind universal income is that actually it's for everyone, regardless of your employment status, which essentially guarantees a minimum way of life, a standard of life, regardless of your income. So that means that if you're not making ends meet on a job, then you are going to make ends meet with the income. So it's not, I don't think it's mutually exclusive. And I think we have to be imaginative, particularly in Western countries where so many of the manufacturing jobs have gone elsewhere. We have to be quite innovative in the way we tackle this sort of thing.
Alex, can I just
Yeah.
I apologize because we've run a slightly over schedule right now. I understand that there are more people who have questions, and that is a testament to how in-depth and thought out Alex's speech was. And I'd like to thank him again for joining us tonight. And I hope that you all enjoyed and learned something as well. I know I did. So the second session is about to start. You will need to go and select the new link from the Facebook page or from the e-bulletin, wherever you've got the links from. I believe Chonkus wants to say one last thing.
Thank you very much for having me, and Chava Shav to you all.